So hello once again. Thank you so much for joining us for our next Talk and Play event. I'm so excited for this particular talk. We've invited an awesome panel, and thankfully we've got some great guests with us as well, and that includes you all as viewers. So thank you for being here. Just wanted to do a quick introduction for what this event is, or what this series is rather. XR for Change is a mission and initiative that Games for Change, the nonprofit, launched in 2017. And we are hoping to build a community of practice that is speaking to why XR tech is important in trying to shift the social needle. And so we're tackling a bunch of different conversations that talk not only about application, but also about creators. And I think we'll hear both sides of that coin today in our panel. These last couple of events are in the lead up to the Games for Change Festival, which will be happening this summer. So if you haven't signed up for that, please do so. It's free to attend. 3 days of awesome programming happening in July. We'll drop the registration link down there for anyone that's interested. But without further ado, let's get started. I'd love to have our moderator, Michaela Ternasky-Holland, jump in and introduce who we have speaking today. Thank you all.
Sounds good. Hi, all. Thank you so much for joining us. Raul, thank you for that great introduction. Just want to say Games for Change is a great organization and the festival is amazing and it's free. So if you are free in July, definitely check it out. It's definitely helped me connect to people with like-minded ideas and like-minded approaches to work. Before I introduce our amazing panelists today, I just want to say a quick solidarity statement. So today's panel, workshop, discussion, however you want to frame it, is being produced from the Lenape-Canarsie territories in what is commonly known as New York. That is where I am located. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the people of these nations, past and present, and emerging. I also want to state that I stand in solidarity to end white supremacy, anti-Blackness, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia, poverty, ageism, and ableism. And I also stand in solidarity against the racial violence against the Asian and Pacific Islander communities, against the Black and Indigenous communities, and any other communities of color. The work that I do is to raise awareness concerning individual, institutional, and systemic violence against our communities and communities of color, and I stand in solidarity with our struggles. So yeah, just wanted to take a moment to set the space. Would love to have my panelists introduce themselves and talk about how awesome they are all as human beings, both within the world of XR and outside of XR. So I'd like to start by handing the mic over to David.
Thank you, Michaela. Wow, I'm super glad to be here. I'm surrounded by such amazing people. So again, I'm a little bit like a fish out of water here. My name is David Lee. I've been helping make teams make things for close to 10 years now. Started out in film, moved on to games, and most recently VR and XR. I'm actually currently the head of studios at BetterUp. We help build novel transformational experiences to help people grow. But a lot of the work that I've done in XR was actually with Viacom. So I was the creative director at Viacom Mix, where we built lots of really exciting stuff. They got around a bunch of festivals for 3 years, and I might be talking a little bit more about those in a bit. But again, I'd like to pass the baton on to the next panelists who to please introduce themselves as well.
Yeah, let's have Jenny.
Hey everyone, super honored to be here and talk about this important issue and what we do in XR space. So my name is Jenny. I'm a cross-border creative producer in the XR space. I started as a filmmaker and electronic art. That's my background. So since 2015, I got super passionate about making VR content. So in the past couple of years, I actually been collaborating with a lot of amazing Asian artists and helping them to produce content and push into a variety of a festival, including Tribeca, Sundance, South by, and last year. Especially, I really want to represent a new type of voice since there's not that many Asian work in this space as well. So being very successful, actually Sundance, we were like the first Chinese project, XR project that Sundance New Frontier Lab has taken on. So very honored to be here and share some of the project I'm being working on, and just thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. Next up, we'll have Theresa.
Hi, thank you, Michaela. Yeah, so my name is Theresa Loong, and I've been in the interactive space for a while now, working with museums and public spaces and artists, and then doing my own work. Similar to perhaps David and Jenny, I do have a background in film, and I'm currently prototyping some projects. And so I come from, my background is, my mom is from Taiwan and my dad is from Malaysia. And so I look forward to this panel and sharing a bit more about my experience and some of the projects, because they're more in prototyping stage, to also like share, yeah, how that's going. Thanks.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Randall.
Hey, everybody. Very, very excited to be here. Excited for this conversation. My name is Randall Okita. I work in film and sometimes television, and I also make sculptures and installations sometimes, and I also make VR. I recently finished a project called The Book of Distance that I made with the National Film Board of Canada, and I'm right now in Toronto.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think I should also divulge a little bit about myself. My name is Michaela Ternasky-Holland. I'm so excited to be moderating this panel. I identify as a creative strategist, consultant, and storyteller. I dabble a lot in the idea of social impact for immersive interactive experiences, as well as telling people's real stories or real people's stories as authentically as possible. So I like to think myself as technology agnostic, but the world keeps pulling me back into XR, which I'm not complaining about. And I've worked a lot with Time Magazine, had a recent piece about the Philippines called Latao, and currently also have a piece being showcased at the Tribeca Festival coming up in June. So that's a little bit about me. Moving back into our panelists. So today's program we've put together is called Creating Unique Legacy, Telling Our Stories. And I know that our stories are all very different and they're all very unique, and they also have similarities. And I think one of the biggest parts about putting something like this together that I spoke to Games for Change about was really breaking apart this idea that the Asian Pacific Islander diaspora, whether you identify as American, Canadian American, or someone who's visiting here from your own country, or working here from your own country, it's not a monolith. We are not like a singular entity of people. And in order to sort of establish that idea, I would love that we all share our family and our backgrounds with the even our history with the United States, because our history with the United States probably looks a lot different from one to the other. So I'll start. I'm actually mixed race. I'm half Filipino, and I'm half other things, but the Filipino side really confuses me because the Philippines could potentially be considered Asian, it could be considered Pacific Island, it could also be considered Southeast Asian. So I'm constantly struggling with like, how do I identify? What is my identity? And so often people tell me I'm not Asian, but I'm Pacific Island. Some people tell me I'm not Pacific Island, I'm Asian. Some people tell me I'm mixed, so I'm neither of those things. I'm also a daughter of a first-generation immigrant, and the only way we were able to actually come to the United States was because my grandfather worked for the US Navy as a Filipino citizen, and then was able to get his citizenship here in the US after spending X amount of time working for the US Navy and being a part of that organization, which was a setup that actually happened post World War II for the Philippines to be able to join the US armies, navies, things like that, and then be able to potentially immigrate here. So that's why I exist here today, is because of a historical event in World War II. So that's to give you all a little bit of background and look at my history with the US and my history as an Asian Pacific Islander. And I'd love to open it up to my panelists. Feel free to jump in, whoever feels like they would like to go first, to give us a little insight into you and your background and history.
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, my mom is from Taiwan and my dad is from Malaysia. But when my dad grew up, Malaysia was a British colony. So I bring that up because when we talk about personal stories, so a documentary that I did that was on public television is called Every Day is a Holiday. Now, even though that title is very positive, right? And memories that my dad has are very positive, he also has some very deep, difficult memories, which I think, I mean, Randall would would love to hear your like you talk about this in a bit. But my father was a prisoner of war in Japan during World War II. So his story about surviving and coming to the States is in a way, you know, an American story, right? An immigrant story. And so definitely I've learned a lot from him, and both he and my mom influence a lot of my work and how I think about identity and race.
Thank you for sharing, Theresa. Anyone else from my panelists?
Sure, I can go next. Am I muted? Nope. You hear me, right? Perfect. Oh gosh, embarrassing. So I'm probably the anomaly here. Like I'm first generation immigrant, and my wife and I we moved to the United States this year, and that we became you know, we got a green card this year. So for the past 10 years, 8 to 10 years that we've been here, we've been on a visa. So, and my background, I was born in Singapore. So when I hear Theresa like Malaysia, I'm like, there's a lot of common history that we have there. But the irony is I didn't grow up in Singapore. You know, my background is very strange. I was born in Singapore, but my parents, because of their work, left to Hong Kong, and then I've lived in Taiwan. Then I lived in portions of the United States. Then I went to live in Australia. So I consider myself of Chinese descent, Singaporean, but not really a sense of belonging to anywhere, which is why very strange. Like now when I'm here in New York, in the United States, I actually feel the most at home, because New York is, you know, a community of the transient diaspora. And it's very, very strange how ironic that has become the case. But so I have a very interesting relationship with the United States because of that. I have grown up, and I spent bits of my childhood in the United States as well. So there's a little bit of like, oh, this feels like home, but not really. And I still struggle with that to this day. And I don't know if I have an easy answer about, like, you know, how I identify as an Asian person in America, just because it's so complicated that I know my worldview is very different from that of an Asian American. So I'll offer you all that.
I will go next then. So my story is also a little bit different. I was born in Beijing. My parents are still in Beijing. I came to States when I was a teenager myself, to Midwest, Ohio. So it's very different than most of the kind of Asian kids. I was the only Chinese back in my high school. It's all white. And also what happened is also my agency back then placed me in a very poor family. So I lived in a trailer for 3 years. So my whole American story is very different from the sort of like, you know, most of like kind of Asian kids come here to college, then, you know, they never would be able to witness what's lower class like in the US. And also most of my high school classmates, they actually are all Trump supporters. So and later on, I lived in New York for almost like a decade. Then after I started to run my business, I go back and forth between Asia and North America again. So I always feel like this is always this kind of difficulty for sort of an outsider trying to fit in the system. So even throughout my teenager life, I have to kind of find my way to figure out who I am. And I sort of developed this idea of I'm just a third culture kid. In a way, I'm not necessarily complete Chinese, because almost half of my life are spent in the States. And there's a portion of that spent in the Midwest. And there's a lot of other part of my identity, more like New Yorker, where I also moved to San Francisco. So there's all those like snippet of who I really am. And you're not gonna really fit in, because I tried really hard when I was a teenager trying to fit in, and you just never work, because people because your color, your accent, your all sorts of how you look and how you sound, they're gonna give you a certain label. But it's really about who you are at the end of the day, like how you identify yourself. And so I really sometimes encourage people always like, even for lots of my friends, they're mixed, they're having a hard time to find, are they really white or they're Asian? I always encourage them, you just yourself, find what's unique about you. So even like sometimes I facing some of those prejudice or racism, I actually have a way to go around it rather than taking it personally, because for me, I'm very unique in my own way. So I even joke about some of my identity, so make people feel like actually I'm very open to discuss who I really am. So thank you.
I love that. Thanks for sharing all that, guys. Um, where do I start? I say that I'm, the son of dualities. My mother was the oldest of 13 East Coast French-speaking Irish Catholics, and my father was the youngest of two West Coast Japanese Canadian farmers. And of course, my grandparents on my father's side were, dispossessed, forced to relocate during the war. And a lot of those stories, as I sort of like get into in our piece, The Book of Distance, I didn't know until I was much older. And a lot of that history is connected with, snippets of stories and a lot of silence. And so I think a lot about in my work about how story, which I think is, this most powerful technology that we have to understand memory and identity and to operate and perform in the processing of and recovery from trauma specifically. So I think that kind of runs through a lot of the things that I think about and work on these days.
Well, thank you all for sharing. I know it's sometimes not easy to go back to like who we are and where we've come from. And it's so easy to just get caught up and here's what I'm doing now. And here's the advice I can give you. And here's what the XR industry needs to work on. But I think giving people an insight and into a look at like how diverse we truly are as a people, as a label necessarily, I think is so important to also say, now here's how that is tying into the work we're doing today. And I mean, obviously, Randall, you were sort of already highlighting sort of the way that you did that with Book of Distance. And I think we would love for you to expound upon that. To give an example, like for me, I'm the oldest of 6 children. So any story that has to do with a sibling kind of relationship is a story that I feel that I can tell very well, or a story I get excited to tell. So that's why with Latau, I decided to create a little brother character that went alongside of our female heroine or protagonist. And that little brother character became sort of the antagonist in the sweetest way in the story. And that was directly influenced by like my background, not just being Filipino, but also just being a sibling, an older sibling, and dealing and hanging out and working with and living with a younger sibling. So yeah, Randall, I'd love for you to keep going on to tell us just a little bit about how that background influenced the Book of Distance and give us a little bit of background about the Book of Distance.
Sure. Where to pick up? I was also going to mention, just in terms of the relationship with the U.S., I don't know if some people don't know this, and I keep hearing this after people try the Book of Distance. But so what happened in the States with Japanese Americans is very similar to what happened in Canada with the Japanese Canadians during World War II. And the Canadian government actually sort of took its cue from the policy that was enacted in the States. So just a little snippet that I wanted to add there. And yeah, I would say for me, the Book of Distance is very much about my journey to know more about my grandfather's story and his history, and my grandmother's, of course, and to understand that I wanted to tell a story that included the questions that I have about my grandfather's story. And so within the project, we have sort of 2 visual languages. One is one of archival documents and photographs that you can take in the piece, and real actual photographs and real actual letters that you can send and receive. And then we also have what we called the language of imagination, which we used a style that we called sort of magical theater, with transforming sets and hand-painted designs. And we wanted to use the combination of those 2 languages to sort of invite the audience into the questions that I have that are sort of between the facts that I know about in my grandfather's story. Yeah, and for us, what we wanted to sort of explore was this notion that engaging with our history can be an embodied act of imagination. It can be playful and not something that's sort of about fixed memorization, and that our histories can be alive and they're not sort of fixed, especially they're not sort of these fixed dominant narratives, but they're multi-layered and multilingual and they can have many perspectives. Yeah, so that's a little bit about it.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from David or Jenny or both of you, obviously, because you have sort of this multicultural, multinational background and sort of experiences, do you feel like that is influencing the way you see the work you're doing today, whether that's within XR or outside of XR? And if so, can you give us a little taste of how or why you think that is sort of playing with one another in your own day-to-day life?
Sure. Jenny, do you want to go first? Not to put the spotlight on you. Sorry.
Okay, so I think definitely because my Chinese background, we have lots of Chinese philosophy. When I take a look at any work right now, I actually do think is actually lots of the work are coming from so I'm a producer, so I actually work with both. So I have worked with artists here and also Chinese artists as well for their work. Actually, to be honest, I don't see much of huge difference in terms for how people tell their story in their own way. For instance, like I was showing the Living Distance at Sundance with Randall. The whole project is about this Chinese artist living in the US, and she was also an engineer at MIT, sent her tools building a robotic sculpture to the space. Then if you think about it, it's kind of weird and distant, but if you go in deep down into the project, you see there's a lot of those how Chinese culture being influenced. For instance, she's from Xinjiang, and for the tooth, there is a saying: when you have a upper tooth fallen, you bury under the ground, and when you have a bottom tooth fallen, you throw up to the sky. So for her, it was a bottom tooth. Then she made this very poetic gesture in terms of course, going through all these engineering work to send her tooth to space. But the whole thing is actually about detachment and coming back. As a person, we leave home and coming back, that kind of cycle. So when you look at it, it looks like this very sci-fi, you're able to send something to the space because our training at MIT, all these, what America and the ground, I mean, this culture can provide and resources. But deep down inside, if you look at the essence, it's about this beautiful poetic story about coming home, which every single of us can relate to. So I started to see a really interesting culture mix when artists are creating their work, especially if they have studied in, for instance, grew up in Asia and migrate to, like immigrate to US, they usually have this both identity, which make the work far more interesting because just the understanding and the culture are being sort of transcend into the work in a very special way. So that's something made me have a very good eye as well in terms of what type of artists I work with. For instance, last year we did this piece called Living Distance. It's actually about COVID, also won this Young Creative Award from International Emmys. The artists are also similar, have a background in Asia, but also grew up in the States a little bit and went to all the university grad school here. So also her language, you see this kind of mixed culture. So we start to see, I think, a lot of those type of projects coming out, that people trying to convey their ideas through different lenses, then be able to share with the audience from different group. You don't need to know Chinese culture to get the idea about detachment, about leaving home and coming back is universal. So I think that's what's beautiful, because some of the artists I talked to in the past, they're very intimidated. For instance, how am I able to make a Chinese film or something about Asian culture and show to the West? Are they able to get that? So, but we see this, like actually people are able, you have to be able to trust your audience, even if they're a Western audience. Same way as lots of Western work being, I also distribute from both sides, being distributed into China. People look at it, first probably they don't understand it, but more and more people look at those indie films or installation, they start to get the language, the culture, because we're living such a, before the pandemic is about globalization. Everyone get to travel, get to see different culture. So I see that more and more kids and more artists are gonna have this multicultural background, and their work is just so beautiful because that kind of mix of culture, even the confusion part in terms of about having multiple identity in their work. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for sharing. That was wonderful. And so exciting to hear that. You know, I think the universality of storytelling is so important. And I think from an American lens, I very much am an American, so I can't speak to the Asian lens. Like, I think storytelling is really powerful and universal. So to hear that, like someone like you who sees that as well is like, great, I'm not a crazy person. David,
Definitely
would
not
love to hear
crazy.
your perspective.
For sure. You know, for me, I've always been an outsider. When you don't have a sense of belonging, you're always an outsider. You tend to want to learn everything and do everything because you're trying to fit in, right? You're trying to fit in, but you don't fit in that group. So you try another group and you dabble in that. And so like, I think I'm the kind of person basically growing up, every 3 months I have a different interest. I'll be playing an instrument for 3 months and I'll be painting another 3 months and then I'll be writing for 3 months. And that sort of informed this sort of like worldview that I have right now where like everything is valid. All art is good. Everything that ought to be created should be created. And maybe that's why I fell into film and then into games and into XR, because like I was looking for the next most inclusive medium that I could find, only to be disappointed by the institutions within them. And then I'll look for the next big one and I'll be disappointed by that. But, you know, coming back to XR a little bit, like it's at one point when, especially in early days in 2015, well, early days for this wave, I know VR has been around for a long time, but, you know, this was really exciting because every discipline was involved. You had artists, you had writers, you had dramaturgs, you know, you had playwrights, you had architects, you had interior designers, all contributing to the form of XR. And that was super exciting to me. And those who know of the work that we did at Viacom Mix, like we wanted to include all the voices as much as we could. One of the things that I did, probably controversially to the company, was we tried to work with as many outside people as we could. And we held fellowships. We invited people to work with us. We paired people from Comedy Central to a young graduate at NYU because we want these voices to intermingle and mix. And so if you look at our portfolio, you see the results. Like we have a swath of different things that were extremely, exactly, yeah, it's extremely ableist, it's true. It's not inclusive at all, and we'll come back to that, Scott, but I'm totally with you, right? Like, so the things we made were extremely bizarre, is one word to say, but also like extremely colorful. And I like to say that it's a good thing because we got in more than just, yay, Theresa, thank you. It was more than just your game designers or your filmmakers, you know, people who were well versed in the art coming on to make art. And you know, we try to bring in as many people as we could. I think one of the proudest things I did at Viacom Mix was to bring a bunch of artists' work to the White House at South by Southlawn, because we showed off. We brought in artists who did not know anything about VR, and we showed them how to use tilt brush, and then got them to paint murals, like 3D murals in tilt brush, and then to show it off at South by Southlawn to President Obama's cabinet, to the visitors. And there, like it felt like an achievement because for the first time technology was used in such a liberating way to people who would not have had access to that technology, right? So that, I think, I want to say this is a product of who I was growing up, because I dabbled in all these things. So I see the value in all these things and the value of including as much as people as I could at the table. Of course, we were not perfect. You know, there's a lot of the people who made stuff, like we still excluded a lot of people. And I think XR is still responsible for excluding and still guilty of excluding a lot of people at seats to this very day. And that's in many reasons why, like, I still work in XR, but I do not think it is an inclusive medium at all. So, you know, Scott, to your point, like that's the problem with me. I'll get into medium, and I think it's the most, you know, I think it's extremely versatile and inclusive, but I'll end up being disappointed. So yeah, that's an insight into my upbringing, and it's very, very little to do with like any of my backgrounds, other than the fact that I've been across so many backgrounds that I see this urge and desire to have everyone participate as much as I physically can.
Yeah. I think I totally can identify. I mean, I went to journalism school, but I dropped out of journalism school to dance on Disney Cruise Line. And then I was running around LA being like, when will New York Times make their own Disneyland? Oh, we can do it in VR. Let's do it in VR. Like, people thought I was crazy because I would see how things that normally might not fit together, right? Like interactive, immersive theme park entertainment and journalism and social impact, like how those two things could I was like, yeah, we have museums, but we could do better than museums, right? And so yeah, people would just be like, what? How do you even see how those two things go together? And I'm like, well, I've literally been a something that people don't realize those two things can go together. I've been a half Asian, half white human. Like some people don't think those two things can go together. So I think, yeah, I love that concept and that idea, David. Thank you so much for sharing. And Theresa, I mean, obviously, with your family background, your family history, I feel like it ties deeply into the types of topics you're talking about and the topics you care about. Would love to hear a little bit about how that's either influencing you now today or from previous projects you've done and what's inspiring you.
Sure, thanks. So I really enjoyed listening to everybody and their comments, and I've seen at least one piece of all your works. I guess so. One, I speak as a fan, and also as a creator. So a couple things that I wanted to bring up. So one is, Randall, your point about like not discovering some of these stories, right, until you're older, and actually being able to potentially use this, well, you use this medium to uncover the stories, right? When I was talking to my dad, he didn't talk to us growing up about his experiences. It was only somehow when he felt like either I could handle it and that also he could trust me. There was this level of trust. And the reason why I bring this up is that even though we love each other, close father-daughter, it's this question of, sometimes you have to produce things very quickly, and that's great. But you also have to know when these projects, if they take the time they take, why that is. And you may discover something that if you're trying to rush too much, you don't have the trust of your subject or subjects. So you're not going to get that piece of content that could really, or that discovery that could really help you, right? So I just share that because, yeah, like I ended up finding my dad ended up sharing a secret diary that he didn't show anyone, that he kept hidden, right? So, and then I was experimenting and then doing a version of that film using the Kinect so that when you created some action, it would trigger the video, right? So in my current work, what I'm working on right now is a very difficult subject matter also. It's the piece is called Bought Broken, and it's about intimate partner violence. And I'm looking at it through the lens of stories from survivors. And so there's also a personal lens to it as well. And so I'm sharing a story and I'm looking at objects that are broken in the relationship as the relationship had devolved. So, you know, it's not just for people who are Asian American survivors, right? This is for allies and people from all across walks of life, right? But the sensitivity that I think I bring to it is, you know, quite informed, of course, from my background, right, culturally and otherwise. I also think that statistics have shown that in the Asian American community, we are reluctant to talk about intimate partner violence or mental health issues, right? It's embarrassing. It's, I mean, other communities have their issues as well, right? So I think that when there is a new technology, whether it's a game or an experience or a film, so the idea of XR, there are ways that we can leverage our capacity for emotion, for embodiment of passions, of problems, and express them.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I would definitely say that sometimes the most poignant stories we tell, whether that feels very personal when people watch them, they can have a broader perspective. But sometimes the most important, poignant stories we tell are stories that we've had personal connections to. And however those stories unfold towards the audience, usually they're connected to us in some way, shape, or form, whether we're creating, whether we're producing, whether we're just designing. You know, we bring a little piece of ourselves into a story. So speaking of bringing a little piece of ourselves, what does the word legacy mean to each of you? Like, what is that? What is that? Like, it's such an interesting little term, but I think that I would love to hear from all of us just what our thoughts are when we think of that term legacy. Because to me, you all are creating legacy in the XR department for Asian Pacific Islander communities. Like, you know, the first steps are there, and in this whole panel, the first steps of this, the first steps of that, the first steps of this, and that doesn't get celebrated a lot. So for me, I think you all are building and creating legacy, but I'd love to hear what that means for you all personally.
Sure, I'll jump in. I mean, I just wanted to say a couple of things that, you know, sparked. I really love what everybody's saying, and, you know, David talking about being an outsider really sparked for me. And I think about this often, you know, whether it's, you know, a cultural context or what have you, but in terms of, you know, you hear outsiders, or you hear people talking about feeling like outsiders often when they get into storytelling. And I feel like, you know, somewhere in that experience is often the seed of observation and the sort of inherent human attempt to try to cross that bridge of otherness and of that distance, and to try to make sense of what, you know, a dominant, often, you know, culture might want or might understand, and to try to find your place. And I think that this it's just a noticeable and you know, a personal, certainly, experience to try to navigate and find your way. And I think that, like, this lends itself to such interesting conversations. And you know, and then that lens can obviously then later on, as we're discovering our own histories or our stories, or we get a little more analytical, that lens can be turned on ourselves, which I think is also part of what we're talking about. And then in terms of legacy, which is, you know, it's a tough one, but for me, I think it's the ideas, if we can contribute to this sort of ongoing conversation and this body of work that helps to, you know, obviously I'm thinking about the Book of Distance these days, but if we can find new and interesting and playful ways to look at our past, and new and interesting ways to tell stories, you know, things that a lot of people would think is fixed, and that we already know these stories and we're aware of this stuff. If we can find new ways to look at those things and to share those things, then, you know, I think that mirrors a different way of looking at the future, which can also feel, you know, inevitable, or it can feel fixed, or it can feel less imaginative than I think that it could. And so for me, obviously, like, there's different stories that I want to tell, that I want to share before I go, but also I'm hoping that it lends and leans into a bigger conversation that is about the way that we can look at each other, you know, the way that we can look at each other in the past, and then hopefully therefore the future.
Great answer. Anyone else want to jump in?
Well, I very much agree with that. And I'm thinking about also what Randall and David had said before, and also Jenny. And there was a comment in the chat about, you know, is XR like inclusive or not, right? So I think one of the items with XR, or with overall experiences, is how can we figure out how to bring in, if you want to say, traditional media, and also, as we're inventing and reinventing for the future. I think that does have a lot to do with legacy, and also what drives me when I think of that term. So it is, you know, as Randall mentioned, things that have been explained in the past, but there are always new ways to reach, whether it's a younger audience or audiences who think they've heard the story, but there are so many stories that are undiscovered, or that can reach us, you know, really reach us in a way that that hasn't been possible yet. And when we talk about empathy, right, and is we are an empathy machine, right? Is that and there's controversy around that, but I do agree in this idea of understanding, and that, at least that goal of having more understanding, and again, using these technologies. What I am interested in, as I had just mentioned earlier, is, yeah, do we take what do we take with the physical, right? And that's where it's experiences or games, and how do we, like, haptics or not haptics, and really a traditional piece, and how do we use the technology and embrace that? And I think that's what, to me, is so exciting, right, and keeps me driven. And someone had made a comment, a person's a student right now, right? And inspired by our work, but we totally look forward to seeing these other pieces that we won't have heard about, right? So World War II generation is, there are only a handful left, right? So it's no longer the survivor stories, unless like the Shoah Foundation and USC, right? Telling these stories by having memories, taping in VR, right? There are these additional ways that we are continuing to move these stories forward.
Yeah, there's no way I can follow up to what Theresa and Randall said, so I'm just not gonna even try. But you know, legacy, there's a lot of alignment here. I think about what little piece of you that gets brought forward, what little piece of our predecessors that have we borrowed and are trying to take forward and pass on. What these little pieces, are they constituent parts of other things that have carried on before us? I mean, that's the simplest form of legacy I can think of. And if you wear that lens, right, everything we're making now, this new culture that we're building with the pieces we've made, what little pieces we've made, what inspirations will you take from this work to build your own legacies after us? I can tell you that, you know, all of you here have heard the stories from us already. All our parts come from so many parts before us. So, I mean, that's legacy to me. And I'll just end off, and I can ramble about this for a long time, but I can say that now is not too late for you to make art in this space. You know, this is still a very, very young art form. So I won't be surprised. You know, you might think that you are a student inspired by us, but you will go on to make work, especially if you start now and you believe in it, you'll make work that will be legacy defining.
I see this, I really like this topic about the legacy, because it's such a big word and people usually talk about like, so for me, I feel it really is about you, like us, this generation. Like I heard a lot of really amazing those immigration type of story. Like for instance, some of my friends, their grandparents coming here, be living in the temple, you know, working in Chinatown. All these stories are out there. But to be honest, I haven't really seen much of media covering Asian American type of story, but they are there. So I think for what legacy really means is like for instance, we got in the VR XR pretty early, right? All of us in a way. I think that's already trying to pioneer such a baby medium to push something. And that is legacy to me. And same with me, like I started making VR film in 2015. And later on, why I started to do every work that's original, working with artists rather than, let's say, a film IP, is because I believe in this mediums for everyone. It's not just you have to be technical, because there's so many people raising this concern about, oh, you need to be a Unity developer, you need to be technical to get in the space. So in the past like 4 years, I've been like very hands-on with a lot of artists I work with. They don't know anything about VR. But I look at their past work and their stories, storytelling, I know they can create something amazing. So we need like really good producer, collaborator to almost encourage the lots of these artists to get into the medium, because for me, VR is so amazing and powerful. I remember like back then watching this Notes on Blindness, this film at Tribeca. It was like probably one of my favorite film about teleporting someone into almost like the world of a blind person. And you can't do that in any traditional way. But VR, you could teleport someone into someone's consciousness. I'm right now producing a piece on bipolar mental illness and using purely just sound. Spatial sound design. So there's so many ways you can innovate and pioneer. To me, that's legacy. Because when you're the first person, like for me, in my case, I convince one artist who are not from XR be able to get into the field and do a good production, being premiered, getting recognized. That to other people is a legacy or example. So other actually, after that piece, the other young artists, especially Asian artists, start to contact me saying, I have this piece of work ideas. Do you think it's gonna work in VR? So I think once you're brave enough, and you know, the funding, everything is like really tough in this circle to even fundraise for your project. But once you're able to take that step and make something, make good art, other people are gonna see and they're gonna be brave and come in. To me, that's the legacy. So maybe like after 4 or 5 projects, I'm gonna see more at least Asians from my side or Chinese artists getting into this medium, be like, I want to create something as well. So the more we see that, then you have a community. For that, that's the legacy you can pass on. In correlation to, I mean, like there's so many wonderful stories about I think Asian Pacific Islander, all these stories like, you know, Michaela talk about. I will want to know your story, to be honest. If there's content about that, I will want to watch it. Because I remember back in college, actually I'm also a poli-sci major. I did my thesis on IRA and hunger strike because I had a dream I was Irish. So I did nothing to do with Asian, but I had a dream because I could be Irish, right? I could be, you know, whatever, American, I could be Chinese, but I had that dream. So I went to Ireland. I did all the research and I did like whole installation just from a Chinese person. What's my take on being an Irish? So I think everything right now we have this gender fluidity, and also I think identity is the same, culture is the same. So XR really, I think opened up. I see lots of amazing female filmmakers in this space, which, you know, in traditional sense, in the game industry or in the film industry, is heavily dominated by male. You don't see much of a female DP, but you do see lots of amazing female DP in the XR space, amazing Unity developer, two brush artists. There are a lot of female artists I really admire. And I think it really opened that space. It's so new. No one get to say, oh, this medium, you have to do that. I think that's the beauty of XR because it's so early. I get to say, I want to do this. I'm not going to use much of visual. I'm going to use a sound to dominate this piece. And I can say that. There's no like, you have to do this or that. So I think just like people who are listening here, I think for legacy is really about you're able to be brave and you're able to help other people to be brave as well, to set that kind of the path for other people. Once the first person do it right, the others, I think they will follow. And we're gonna see this really amazing creative work. Like for instance, Randall's work was really beautiful. I know very little about, you know, like the Japanese culture, but they were called living distant. They're like book of distance, we're next to each other. But he get to see our film, get to know a little bit about how a Chinese artist sort of think and using an engineering work as well. And we get to see this beautiful story he produced about his family. So it's like really amazing, this kind of transformation from what we usually see just very like about just culture here. Now we see this variety of culture, Canadian culture, Japanese culture, all these. So that's something I want to share. So very excited to be here.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with all of you. One of the biggest things that I love about working in XR, extended reality, immersive interactive storytelling is I'm like, what rules? Because I just go and break all of them. Or what barriers, what boundaries, what like institutions telling me I have to have a 1920 by 1080 and I have to have a medium shot and a close-up shot and an over-the-shoulder shot. I'm like, oh, like we just get to play and have such a great time playing in this medium and continuing to grow this medium. And for me, I think, and we only have about 7 minutes left, so I want to start to wrap up. For me, I think legacy isn't just about what story we're telling, but how we're going to tell that story. Like if we're going to tell a story about a Japanese Canadian, let's make sure that Japanese Canadian is a director, is a collaborator, is a producer, right? Like I would hope that like the legacy that we can carry on is that people who look and people who have that background are the ones that are being empowered. They are the ones that are being funded to tell that story, not potentially other people who have come in and exploited their stories before for their own gain, for their own personal achievable process, for their own awards table. I'm so much more about like, let's make sure that the creators are creating what they want to create and the communities are financially supported to tell their own stories and not just have sort of performative allyship happening. So that for me would be like an amazing legacy to see carry out through the XR industry if all of us like choose to make sure we fight for that type of representation in the producer room, in the creative room, in the writer's room, as they say in film, right? But for us, it would probably be in the digital reality room. Anyway, so I do just want to end with some questions from the audience, but before we do that, I like to end on a light note. So think about one thing in pop culture. It could be something maybe that no one knows about because it's a pop culture specific to you that has really influenced you to get involved into XR. And it's just like that one word or those two words. If there was anything that inspired you, it could be like a superhero, it could be an intellectual property, like, you know, because XR, I feel like a lot of us, we have like a background with like deep nerd roots. So for me, it was Star Wars. Like if it wasn't for Star Wars, I don't know if I would be an XR today. And I'd love to like hear from my other panelists, like just those one or two words, like what inspired you to be like, yeah, that could be something. I'll put a headset on my head.
Back to the Future 2. Boom.
That's not an easy one. Well, I'll say ice resurfacer or Zamboni.
And while the panelists answer, if there's any questions from the audience, you are more than welcome to drop it into the chats and hopefully we can get to maybe one or two questions. I see we have a hand raised as well. Jenny, Randall, pop culture, something we might not know, something we do know.
So much sci-fi, you know, everything teleportation, physicality, but also, you know, like fun houses as well.
Maybe
haunted houses. Sorry, Jenny, go ahead.
maybe just reading Ready Player One. Also, actually, how I got in VR, it was visiting Elon Musk's factory. That's where blowing me away because I won a competition, so I get to visit. And literally, that's like 2014 or 15, I forgot. That I literally see giant robot working together. Like that's like, but Silicon Valley keep teaching about this idea when you build a startup, do something 10x. I never get that because I was living in New York. Everyone is like, it's about, you know, very risk averse city, but like, I went to the factory, I see like scientists riding bicycles. So almost to me is like this Japanese manga in some way, like just seeing that. So after I started to think, am I able to build something that's about future rather than a problem I want to solve now? So I think that's like a very big turning point for me. Yeah.
Yeah, Phantom Menace in second grade, like forget it. Awesome. Any questions from the audience? I know we had a hand raised and I want to make sure if that hand is still raised, we potentially can get to your question in the next minute or two.
I think JD had a question.
Hand up.
Oh.
Yes. JD?
I put the question in the chat. Thank you. And Terry, thank you for the response there. But I was just curious to know, like, you know, what could schools do today or in the next couple of years to help prepare this next generation of artists that could maybe follow in your footsteps and build on this legacy you've been talking about?
Yeah, Theresa, I know you had a ton of resources you were talking about before we started the panel. David,
yeah, sure.
I feel like you'd have some really great thoughts on this.
So very quickly, so I've been a recipient of two grants, one or two opportunities, which we could put into the chat. One is Oculus Launchpad is the application's just opened for this coming year for the cohort. So that's you know, developing with the Oculus headset. Also the International Game Developers Association, they have Prototype Fund. And then there's another called Mass Digi. Now these are for either students in college and then or young professionals or professionals, people curious about the field. For K-12, I'm not as familiar. So I'll have to get, if there's a way to get back, you know, we could contact the folks at Games for Change. But perhaps David or Randall or Jenny have some suggestions.
I'll just jump on very quickly because actually you listed down the foundation, the IGDA, which I believe a lot, and the IGDA Foundation especially is really supportive there. I'll add on actually, you know, so a lot of folks who are already looking to make and are building in VR, I think they're set. They will find the resources. I would say encourage people who wouldn't otherwise, you know, play in virtual worlds right now. Get them to play it. Roblox is pretty cool. Fortnite's actually really cool. there are lots of actually really good educational programs that come out of these. I know Minecraft has one. I know Fortnite has one. So it's, actually let them play the games and let them build in those worlds. This is not a direct path to XR, but it's actually a very relevant one because, it might be a while before XR becomes like prevalent because it's still fairly niche, but real-time game engine worlds, that will be here to stay. So let them play their games and encourage them and support them and let them build in those worlds.
Yeah, I
Thank you.
second that. I'd also say 360 cameras are really cheap, like the little Insta 360s, and so are Oculus Quest headsets, and cheap being relative, but only a couple $100s. So, I mean, even if like, your school can secure a little bit of funding to have a Quest headset for all of the classes to share so that they could have one 360 little camera. So the classes can just even start playing with what it is to like take a 360 photo or a 360 video. The latest iPhone has like photogrammetry qualities now. You literally just need a phone app and you just start taking photos and like, oh my gosh, you can create a rendered world of wherever you are inside your classroom. Like Matterport has a really great iPhone. You can even start playing with like Matterport technology, which is another sort of photogrammetry capture technology. So there's some really fun stuff they can even start working with now that doesn't need like all these big crazy processing like computer power, just to get them dabbling in world building, just like what David said. And
Awesome.
imagination is so important.
So important. I totally agree with that. And I was just going to add, you don't have to know, like, we don't know everything. Nobody knows everything. Don't feel like you have to have a good sense of what's happening or the technology before you start bringing it into the classroom. Let the kids play, let them teach you, and just make sure that there's a sense that they understand that there's authorship behind the thing that they're playing, that people are creating these things, because I think that sometimes gets lost. And all you have to do is mention that for people to understand that the things that they love and the worlds that they love spending time in are created by people, and that's an option, and then the rest is just, expose them to code.
Thank you. This is great. I'm like furiously writing notes, but I really appreciate that.
Awesome. Well, we're 2 minutes over time, and I don't want to keep anyone past the time that we said we would keep people. So I just want to say, wow, I'm smiling from ear to ear. This has been so incredibly wonderful. For anyone who is interested, we are going to have a chapter 2 to this panel at Games for Change, which we're currently building out and figuring out. But if you're interested in continuing to follow sort of this APIA narratives to the front vertical that Games for Change has started, feel free to check it out at Games for Change Festival. And yes, please check out the festival in general. It's going to be amazing, and I'm incredibly excited by what they're putting together. And again, thank you to my panelists, David, Jenny, Theresa, Randall. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your incredible words, your insight, your wisdom. Have a wonderful rest of your Thursday, y'all.
Thanks for having us.
Yes,
See you at the
thank
festival,
you.
everybody.